Picture this. A woman's hand is shaking as she ties her apron strings in a Manhattan steakhouse bathroom, staring at her reflection like she's about to walk into battle, not serve dinner. And if you stick with me for the next few minutes, you'll understand why the billionaire who humiliated her tonight made the biggest mistake of his life. Hit that subscribe button right now because the story about power, revenge, and a waitress who speaks 5 languages is about to get wild. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when the rich guy realizes he picked the wrong target. Her name is Noelle Kincaid, and before we get to the moment that changes everything, you need to understand something most people in that dining room never saw. The woman refilling water glasses wasn't who she appeared to be, and that invisibility was exactly the point. See, Noelle learned early that in America, people judge your uniform before they ever ask your story, and she'd been using that blind spot her entire adult life, wearing it like armor while she built something nobody expected underneath. Growing up outside Tucson, Arizona, bouncing between a trailer park and her aunt's couch after medical bills from her mother's cancer crushed their family into dust, Noelle took whatever work kept the lights on. Dish pits that burned her hands, diner shifts that lasted until her feet bled through her shoes, hotel laundry rooms where she folded rich people's clothes while her own hung threadbare in a closet the size of a bathroom stall. But here's what separated her from every other survival story you've heard. While other people collapsed under that weight, Noelle stacked credentials like ammunition, attending community college classes after double shifts, transferring to a state university program that let her finish 2 degrees through a patchwork of scholarships and spite, then adding certificate after certificate because she understood that poverty doesn't forgive second chances, and she refused to fail again. Now drop a comment below if you've ever worked a job where people treated you like you were invisible, because what Noelle did with that invisibility is the setup for everything that's coming. While she was serving tables at this Midtown Manhattan steakhouse, acting like just another pretty face who needed rent money, nobody knew she spoke Spanish from years in restaurant kitchens, Arabic and French from an immigrant church network in Queens where she volunteered, German from a night tutor she traded babysitting hours with, plus bits of Mandarin and Portuguese from the one job she never talked about in polite company, contract translation work for a legal aid clinic that helped women file restraining orders and wage theft claims against powerful men who thought their money made them bulletproof. That translation work put her too close to a corporate case tied to a billionaire's so-called charity circles. And when threats started showing up in her inbox, cryptic messages that knew where she lived and what route she took home, Noelle made a calculated choice. She took the safest, most invisible place she could think of, a high-end restaurant where billionaires came to feel powerful and waitresses were supposed to smile and disappear. If you think she was hiding, you're half right, but keep watching because the other half is what makes this story legendary. The night Graham Sutter walked through those doors, the entire room shifted. Custom suit that probably cost more than Noelle made in 6 months. Security detail lingering by the entrance like soldiers guarding a general. And a laugh that made other diners hurry through their meals like they were suddenly late to their own lives. He wasn't alone either, and this detail matters, so pay attention. He had a ring of slick investors from Miami, Houston, and Silicon Valley, men with Rolexes and nervous energy, plus 2 glamorous women who weren't wearing wedding rings but kept touching his shoulder like it was an investment strategy, their fingers lingering just long enough to signal ownership without commitment. Smash that like button if you already know this type of man, the kind who treats people like accessories and relationships like portfolios, because Graham Sutter was a masterclass in buying influence and renting loyalty. The manager, Rhett Callahan, assigned Noelle to table 12 with instructions that made her stomach turn. He wanted a pretty face who wouldn't talk back, someone to make the billionaire feel important without challenging his ego, and Rhett's eyes swept over Noelle like she was a prop he was positioning on a stage. She nodded, smiled that service industry smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and walked toward the table while her brain was already 3 moves ahead, cataloging faces, accents, body language, the small tells that separate real power from performed confidence. Before she even reached them, Graham was snapping his fingers at another server, that sharp crack of entitlement that makes everyone in earshot flinch, and Noelle felt that old familiar rage rise in her chest, the kind that comes from years of swallowing disrespect just to keep a paycheck. Here's where it gets interesting, so drop a comment saying, "I've been there," if you've ever had to bite your tongue at work while someone treated you like garbage. Because what happened next is the moment Noelle stopped playing small. Graham ordered expensive wine he couldn't pronounce, butchering French like it was a personal insult to the language, then snapped his fingers again when Noelle approached with menus. When she politely corrected his wine pairing, suggesting something that would actually complement the steaks he'd ordered instead of clashing with them. Graham leaned back in his chair, looked at his investors like they were in on a joke, and said loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "Stick to refilling water, sweetheart. Education isn't your lane." The investors laughed, uncomfortable but complicit, and the two women beside Graham smiled like this was entertainment they'd paid to see. Noelle said nothing, just placed the menus down with hands that didn't shake, and that's when Graham reached for his water glass, knocked it deliberately toward himself, and in the same breath tried to blame her for the spill, his hand jerking up in a motion that looked dangerously close to a slap, his palm open and rising, and the entire dining room froze on that ugly second, that moment where violence hangs in the air like smoke before a fire. Subscribe right now if you want to see what happens when the underdog stops playing defense and goes straight for the throat, because Noelle looked at that raised hand, looked at the investors watching with mixed expressions of shock and curiosity, and made a choice that would detonate Graham's entire empire. She apologized, that quiet "I'm sorry" that service workers say when they're not sorry at all, when they're buying time and calculating angles, and then she turned to the investor seated to Graham's left and switched languages so smoothly it sounded like a different person had moved into her body. In flawless Spanish, she greeted the Miami investor with warmth, asking about his daughter's quinceañera that he'd posted about on social media 3 weeks ago, dropping details only someone who'd done research would know, and his face shifted from amused to confused in the span of a breath. Then she pivoted to the French investor, correcting a phrase he'd used earlier with the precision of a professor, not rudely but with such authority that his posture straightened involuntarily, the way students do when they realize the substitute teacher isn't actually a substitute. The Gulf Arabic joke from the Houston investor got answered without hesitation, Noelle's pronunciation so clean it made him blink twice, and that's when the table started to understand something was very, very wrong with their evening. But Noelle wasn't just showing off languages like party tricks, she was building a case in real time right there over appetizers and wine, and if you're not subscribed yet, do it now because what she said next is the kind of power move that ends careers. She started dropping specific, checkable facts about Graham's business empire, details that shouldn't be public knowledge but were buried in Delaware shell company filings, talking about his clean energy claims that were already being challenged by environmental agencies, mentioning a harassment settlement hidden behind NDAs that involved a former executive assistant and a payoff large enough to buy silence but not dignity. She referenced a merger presentation Graham had given 2 months ago, pointing out numbers that didn't match public records, discrepancies between what he promised investors and what his actual quarterly reports showed, and with each sentence, each devastating fact delivered in the investor's native language, you could watch their faces change from amused to panicked, from confident to calculating their exits. The Spanish investor's pen stopped moving on his contract. The French investor pulled out his phone, probably to call his legal team. The Houston investor leaned back like he'd just realized he was sitting next to a bomb. And when Noelle repeated the key line in each of their languages, "If you sign tonight, you own the risk, not him," their pens hovered in the air like they just remembered gravity exists and it pulls everyone down eventually, even billionaires. Hit that like button if you love watching powerful people realize they've been played, because Graham's face went from amused to furious in the time it takes a heart to skip a beat, and that's when he wiped water off his cuff with deliberate slowness, smiled like a predator who just spotted prey trying to run, and pointed directly at Rhett Callahan standing near the bar. "Get rid of this trash," Graham said, his voice carrying across the dining room like an execution order. "Or I buy this building and evict every last one of you by Friday." The threat hung in the air, specific and credible because everyone in that room knew Graham Sutter had the money and the meanness to follow through, and that's when Rhett made the choice that would define the rest of this story. His eyes flicked to the private dining room, to the VIP list on his podium, to the future he wanted where he owned restaurants and knew powerful people, and in the most painful betrayal of the night, he chose money over truth, security over solidarity, his own survival over the woman who just put her entire life on the line to warn strangers about fraud. He grabbed Noelle's wrist hard enough to leave marks, fingers digging into her skin like he was trying to hold onto his own sinking ship, and hissed through clenched teeth, "You're fired. Now." Security guards appeared like they'd been waiting for this moment, hands on Noelle's arms, steering her through the dining room while she was still trying to warn the investors, her voice rising with urgency that nobody wanted to hear, and they pushed her through the lobby, past the hostess stand, out onto the wet Manhattan sidewalk where the city lights reflected off puddles and made everything look like broken glass. Comment justice if you think what happened next is what Rhett deserved. Because back inside that steakhouse, Graham adjusted his tie, the two women beside him laughed like they just watched a particularly good movie scene, and the investors, still nervous, still uncertain, started signing contracts anyway, because fear is a currency too, and Graham Sutter spent it like cash, buying compliance with threats and sealing deals with intimidation while Noelle stood outside in the rain trying to remember how to breathe. Her hands were shaking, throat burning with unshed tears and swallowed rage. And this is the moment where strong people look small, where years of holding it together finally crack, where you realize that your silence never kept you safe, it just made you easier to hurt. But here's where this story flips from tragedy to something else entirely. Something that'll make you rethink everything you just watched. So make sure you're subscribed because what happens in the next 10 seconds changes the entire game. Noelle stumbled behind a parked car, trying to catch her breath, trying to figure out where she'd go because she couldn't go home if Graham was serious about his threats. And that's when her phone buzzed. Not from a friend, not from family, but from a blocked number with one line of text that made her blood run cold and hot at the same time. "You did exactly what we needed. Do not go home." Before she could process those words, a woman stepped out of a black SUV parked half a block down, moving with the calm precision of someone who does this professionally. And she was holding a badge and a folder with Graham Sutter's name printed on the tab. She wasn't there to save Noelle out of kindness or sympathy or some random act of justice. She was there because Noelle's languages weren't just a flex, they were a tool, and that restaurant job wasn't just survival, it was strategic positioning. The federal agent looked at Noelle with the expression of someone watching a chess piece execute its purpose perfectly and said, "You're not fired, you're extracted." And Graham Sutter just confessed to fraud in 4 languages in front of witnesses we've been trying to wire for 6 months. That's when everything Noelle thought she knew about her own life rearranged itself into a different picture. A bigger picture. And if you want to know how a waitress became bait in a federal investigation that's about to bring down a billionaire's empire, you need to stay locked in for what comes next. So here's my question for you, and I want to see your answers in the comments because this matters. If you were Noelle, standing on that sidewalk, realizing you'd just been used as bait by federal agents without fully understanding the danger you were in, would you walk away and disappear? Or would you go back inside that restaurant and finish what you started? Drop your answer below. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Graham discovers the waitress he humiliated was actually the trap that's about to snap shut on his entire criminal network. And I'll see you in the next chapter of this story, because trust me, this is only the beginning. If you're just joining us, hit that subscribe button right now because you're about to watch a waitress transform into a weapon, and trust me when I say the billionaire who humiliated her has no idea what's coming. So drop a like if you're ready to see Graham Sutter's empire crumble, and let's jump straight into the moment where Noelle Kincaid discovers she's been playing a game she didn't even know existed. The federal agent standing next to that black SUV isn't offering comfort or sympathy. Her name is Agent Rebecca Torres, and she's holding a folder thick enough to prosecute a small army. Her eyes cold and calculating as she looks at Noelle like a chess master examining a piece that just executed its move perfectly. And when she says, "Get in the car, we need to debrief before his security pulls street camera footage," it's not a request, it's an extraction protocol, and Noelle realizes with stunning clarity that her entire life for the past 8 months has been a lie she told herself while the truth operated underneath. Inside that SUV, with tinted windows and the smell of leather and government-issued coffee, Torres spreads documents across her lap like she's dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game. And here's what Noelle learns in the 20-minute drive to a federal building in Lower Manhattan. Graham Sutter isn't just a corrupt billionaire. He's the linchpin in an international fraud network that spans 3 continents, using shell companies in Delaware, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg to launder money from defense contracts, pharmaceutical price-fixing schemes, and real estate scams that displaced thousands of low-income families while he posed for charity galas. Comment, burn it down, if you think rich people who steal from the poor deserve everything that's coming. Because what Torres reveals next is the kind of conspiracy that makes your blood boil and your faith in justice flicker like a candle in a hurricane. The legal aid clinic where Noelle did translation work wasn't just helping random women file wage theft claims. Those women were connected to Graham's business partners, executives who used the same playbook Graham perfected. Hire vulnerable women, exploit them, threaten them, pay them off, then bury the evidence behind NDAs and legal firms that specialize in making problems disappear. Torres explains that federal investigators had been trying to penetrate Graham's inner circle for 2 years, but his security was too tight, his lawyers too aggressive, his money too effective at buying silence, and every witness they approached either refused to cooperate or mysteriously withdrew their testimony after receiving anonymous threats. But then Noelle's name appeared in a case file cross-reference, a woman with linguistic skills and legal aid connections who'd gone underground after receiving threats tied to Graham's network, and someone in the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit made a calculated bet. What if they didn't recruit her officially? What if they just positioned her where Graham frequented and waited to see if her skills would naturally create an opportunity? Subscribe right now if this level of manipulation makes you uncomfortable, because Torres isn't apologizing for using Noelle as bait without her explicit consent. She's explaining it like a tactical decision that worked, her voice flat and professional as she says, "You were never in danger we couldn't monitor, and your performance tonight gave us recorded evidence of fraud admission in multiple languages, which creates prosecutorial advantages in 4 different jurisdictions." Noelle sits there processing this information, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline crash, and she asks the question that cuts through all the federal bureaucracy. "Did you know he was going to try to hit me?" Torres doesn't flinch when she answers. "We calculated a 73% probability of physical intimidation based on his pattern analysis, and we had agents positioned to intervene if he made contact, but you de-escalated before intervention became necessary. Drop a comment saying not okay if you think the FBI crossed a line by putting Noelle in danger without full disclosure, because what Noelle does next defines everything that follows. She doesn't cry, doesn't collapse, doesn't demand to be taken home. Instead, she leans forward, looks Torres dead in the eye, and says, "What else don't I know about my own life?" And that question opens a door neither woman can close, because Torres realizes Noelle isn't a victim looking for rescue. She's a player demanding to see the full game board, and if the federal government is going to use her as a weapon, she wants to hold the trigger herself. But while Noelle is learning she's been a federal asset for 8 months, Graham Sutter is pacing his penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side, phone pressed to his ear, and his voice has that dangerous quiet that people who know him recognize as the sound before violence. The Miami investor pulled out of the deal 40 minutes after leaving the restaurant, citing concerns about due diligence that require additional review, which is diplomatic language for "that waitress scared me straight." And when Graham checks his secure email, he finds similar messages from Houston and Silicon Valley, polite withdrawals and requests to postpone that translate to, "We think you're radioactive and we're running for cover." This is the moment when powerful men realize they're not actually invincible, when the machinery they built to protect themselves starts showing cracks, and Graham's response isn't introspection or course correction. It's rage, pure and refined, the kind that turns people into weapons pointed at anyone who dared to embarrass them. Hit that like button if you've ever watched a bully realize they picked a fight they can't win, because what Graham does next shows you exactly who he is when the mask slips and the monster underneath starts making decisions. He calls Vivian March, one of the 2 women who was touching his shoulder at dinner, and when she answers, her voice has that practiced calm of someone who specializes in cleaning up messes. Vivian isn't arm candy or a trophy date. She's Graham's fixer. The woman who makes problems disappear using methods that don't appear on any official ledger. And her first question is tactical. "Do we know her name yet?" Graham pulls up the restaurant's employee records through a contact at the management company, finds Noelle Kincaid's basic information, and within minutes Vivian has run background checks through private databases that most people don't know exist. The kind that cost 5 figures per query and deliver information that includes addresses, phone records, financial history, and known associates. What Vivian finds makes her pause, makes her voice shift from routine to concerned when she calls Graham back. "Your waitress has a background that doesn't make sense. Gaps in employment history, addresses that bounce between Queens and New Jersey, and linguistic certifications that shouldn't exist for someone working service industry, plus encrypted communication with a legal aid clinic that handled cases against your Houston partners last year." Subscribe if you're not already, because this is where the story splits into multiple threads that all lead toward collision, and you need to see how each piece moves across the board before they crash into each other. Graham hears Vivian's report and makes a decision that will define the next 72 hours. He doesn't just want Noelle fired and humiliated. He wants her destroyed completely, her reputation shredded so thoroughly that any testimony she might give would be dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed woman with an axe to grind. He tells Vivian to activate their media contacts, the journalists who take money to run stories without asking questions, the social media amplification networks that can turn a nobody into a villain overnight, and the legal teams that specialize in filing harassment and defamation claims designed to bankrupt defendants before trial. This is how billionaires fight when they feel threatened, not with fists or obvious violence, but with lawyers and narrative control and systems designed to crush individuals who dare challenge power structures. Meanwhile, back at the steakhouse, Rhett Callahan sits in his office watching security footage on a loop, and what he sees makes his stomach turn because he's not stupid, he's just been willfully blind, and now the blindness is costing him everything he built. On screen, he watches Noelle speak to those investors with precision that looks rehearsed, watches how she positioned herself to control sightlines and ensure Graham's security couldn't approach without causing a scene, watches the way she dropped specific facts that required research and preparation, and he realizes with dawning horror that his restaurant has been under surveillance and he never noticed. Comment, too late, if you think Rhett deserves what's coming for choosing money over integrity. Because what he does next seals his fate and proves that cowardice compounds into catastrophe when you keep choosing the wrong side. Instead of calling his lawyer or shutting down and cooperating with any investigation, Rhett calls Graham's assistant and offers complete cooperation. Access to employee records, security footage, schedule information, anything Graham needs to identify and neutralize the threat Noelle represents. This is the anatomy of betrayal in real time, watching someone dig their own grave because they're too scared to face consequences and too greedy to walk away from proximity to power. Rhett even offers to file criminal harassment charges against Noelle, claiming she threatened guests and created a hostile environment. And he's already drafting the statement when his head chef, a man named Eduardo who worked with Noelle for 6 months, walks into the office and says, "You're really going to let that rich prick destroy her for telling the truth?" Rhett doesn't even look up when he answers, "I'm going to save my business and my reputation, and if that means she takes the fall, then that's the cost of her playing games above her pay grade." Eduardo quits on the spot, walks out through the kitchen without collecting his final check, and Rhett tells himself this is just business, just survival, just doing what anyone would do in his position, which is exactly what people say when they know they're wrong but choose money anyway. Now we're 48 hours past the restaurant confrontation, and if you're wondering why Noelle hasn't gone public or why Graham hasn't been arrested yet, you're asking the right questions because justice moves slower than rage and federal cases require evidence chains that can survive appellate review. Drop a like if you're frustrated by how long it takes to bring down powerful people, because what happens in this middle section is the grinding, exhausting reality of fighting systems designed to protect wealth and punish whistleblowers. Agent Torres keeps Noelle in a safe house in New Jersey, a bland apartment complex where nobody asks questions and the surveillance is subtle but constant. And every morning Torres arrives with updates that sound like victories but feel like stalemates. Graham's lawyers filed motions to seal court documents related to his business dealings. Investors are refusing to testify without immunity deals that take weeks to negotiate, and the Delaware shell companies are registered under layers of holding corporations that require international cooperation to penetrate. But here's where the stakes multiply in ways nobody predicted, where the personal becomes structural and the case becomes something bigger than one woman versus one billionaire. So make sure you're subscribed because this twist changes everything we thought we understood about the scope of Graham's corruption. Torres shows Noelle a document that makes her blood run cold. Graham wasn't bluffing when he threatened to buy the restaurant building. He's already moving forward with acquisition plans through a real estate investment trust he controls, and the target isn't just that one building. It's an entire city block in Midtown Manhattan where multiple businesses operate, including 2 legal aid offices, a women's shelter, and a community legal clinic that handles pro bono immigration cases. The plan, laid out in internal memos Torres's team intercepted through a warrant, is to purchase the properties, evict all tenants claiming lease violations or building code emergencies, then demolish or renovate for luxury condos, effectively erasing the infrastructure that helps vulnerable populations fight back against exploitation. Comment evil genius if you're horrified by how Graham uses real estate as a weapon to eliminate witnesses and destroy support systems, because this is the playbook of modern villains. They don't just attack individuals, they attack the systems that protect individuals, and they do it through legal channels that look legitimate on paper while serving brutal purposes underneath. Noelle realizes something that makes her whole body go tense. The women she helped at that legal aid clinic, the ones who filed restraining orders and wage claims, they weren't random cases. They were connected to Graham's business partners, men in his network who shared tactics and protected each other. And if Graham destroys that physical space and displaces those organizations, years of case documentation could be lost. Witnesses could scatter beyond contact, and the network could reorganize around the gap without consequences. This is when Noelle stops thinking about her own safety and starts thinking about the larger war. And she asks Torres a question that shifts their entire dynamic. If I testify and the case falls apart because his lawyers bury us, what happens to those women and those organizations? Torres doesn't have a good answer, which is itself an answer. But while Noelle is calculating risk in a New Jersey safe house, Graham's media campaign is already hitting critical mass. And if you've ever watched someone get destroyed on social media for telling the truth, you'll recognize the tactics he uses. Hit subscribe if you're not already locked in, because this section is about how billionaires weaponize narrative and turn public opinion into a bludgeon against anyone who threatens them. Vivian coordinates the attack across multiple platforms. First comes an anonymous leak to a gossip blog claiming Noelle harassed wealthy patrons at the steakhouse and made false accusations for attention. Then comes a profile in a tabloid newspaper describing her as an unstable con artist who preys on successful men. Then comes video footage edited to remove context, showing only Noelle speaking intensely at the table while Graham looks confused and defensive, making it appear she's the aggressor and he's the victim. Drop a comment saying, "We see through it," if you recognize this playbook, because it's the same one used against every whistleblower and truth-teller who challenges power. Isolate them, discredit them, make them look crazy or opportunistic, then watch as public opinion does the rest of the work. Noelle's face goes viral, but the narrative isn't about courage or truth. It's about a disturbed woman who targeted a generous philanthropist and harassed him in public because she wanted attention or money or revenge for some imagined slight. Former co-workers from the steakhouse are interviewed, carefully selected for their willingness to say negative things in exchange for compensation they don't disclose, and they describe Noelle as odd, secretive, someone who didn't fit in and made people uncomfortable with her intensity. Eduardo, the chef who quit in protest, tries to defend her online and gets buried under so much harassment and doxing that he deletes all his social media within 12 hours. This is the empire striking back, and it's effective because most people don't have the attention span or investigative skills to distinguish between truth and well-funded propaganda. And what makes it worse is that Rhett Callahan files official charges, criminal harassment and making terroristic threats, which gives the false narrative legal weight and makes it easier for media outlets to cover the story as if both sides deserve equal consideration. Ask yourself this question and put your answer in the comments. If you saw Noelle's face on social media right now with headlines calling her unstable and dangerous, would you believe her story or Graham's version? Because that's the test of our moment. That's what separates people who think critically from people who absorb whatever narrative has better production value. And it's why Graham's strategy works more often than it fails. Noelle watches this unfold from the safe house, sees her face attached to lies, watches strangers dissect her life and call her names, and Torres sees the toll it takes. The way Noelle's shoulders curl forward like she's trying to make herself smaller, the way her hands shake when she scrolls through comments calling her trash and grifter and psycho. But here's what Torres doesn't fully understand yet, what nobody understands until it's too late. Noelle has been underestimated her entire life, and every time someone counted her out, she used that dismissal as cover to rebuild herself stronger. Subscribe and turn on notifications because what Noelle does next flips the entire dynamic from defense to offense, and Graham Sutter is about to learn that the waitress he humiliated is actually the most dangerous player on the board. The federal case hits roadblocks. Graham's lawyers file motions claiming prosecutorial overreach. One key witness recants testimony after receiving threats. Evidence gets tied up in challenges about warrant validity. And Torres can see the case slipping away, death by 1,000 legal cuts that rich defendants specialize in inflicting. She gives Noelle two options, laying them out with the clinical precision of someone who's done this before. Option 1 is witness protection, full relocation with a new identity, guaranteed safety but also guaranteed irrelevance because Noelle would have to disappear completely and let the case proceed without her active participation, which might mean Graham walks free if the evidence doesn't hold without her testimony. Option 2 is going public, using her story and her evidence to force the investigation into sunlight where it's harder to bury. But that means exposing herself to Graham's full retaliation, including Vivian's methods. which Torres describes carefully as extralegal problem-solving that has resulted in hospitalizations and disappearances in the past. Drop a comment saying go public or stay hidden, and tell me what you'd choose if you were in Noelle's position. Because this is the moment where survival instinct wars with purpose, where staying quiet means staying safe but also means letting a monster win. Torres lays out the specific risks. If Noelle goes public, Graham's fixer will come for her, not necessarily to kill her because that's too obvious, but to make her wish she'd stayed quiet through intimidation, harassment, potentially violence that stops short of permanent damage but achieves the goal of silence through fear. The agent's voice is flat when she says, "I can't guarantee your safety if you choose exposure, and I need you to understand that going public might not even work. He could still win, and you'd have sacrificed your safety for nothing." But what Torres doesn't understand, what she can't understand because she's never been poor and powerless and forced to swallow injustice just to survive, is that Noelle has already lived through worse than Graham's threats, and silence has never protected her. It's only made her complicit in her own erasure. Noelle sits with that choice for exactly 7 minutes, which Torres times on her watch, and when she looks up, her eyes have that hardness that comes from deciding to burn the boats and fight forward because retreat isn't survival if you're just waiting to be hunted later. She says, "My silence kept me employed but never kept me safe, and if I hide now, those women at the legal aid clinic lose their support system, that block gets demolished, and Graham does this to someone else next month. So you're going to teach me how to go public without getting killed, and we're going to use every platform I can access to make his crimes impossible to ignore." Torres nods slowly, not with approval exactly but with recognition, the way soldiers recognize each other across battlefields, and she makes a phone call that sets into motion everything that follows, the machinery of exposure that will either bring Graham down or destroy Noelle completely, and right now the odds look about 50-50, which is better than they've been all week. What Noelle doesn't know yet, what nobody knows except Vivian and Graham, is that the fixer has already been deployed, already started tracking Noelle's digital footprint and physical location, already identified the safe house through traffic camera analysis and surveillance patterns that federal agents think are secure but aren't when someone has unlimited budget and no moral boundaries. Vivian sits in her own office downtown, a minimalist space with zero personal touches and the sterile efficiency of someone who treats violence like accounting. And she's building a dossier on Noelle that includes psychological weaknesses, relationship leverage points, financial vulnerabilities, and tactical approaches ranging from legal harassment to physical intimidation, each option laid out with estimated effectiveness percentages and risk assessments. Hit that like button if this level of calculated evil makes your skin crawl, because Vivian isn't crazy or emotional. She's methodical, and that makes her more dangerous than Graham's rage ever could be. Graham himself is spiraling in ways that his public image doesn't show, behind the press releases about his charitable foundation and the carefully staged photos at fundraising galas. He's making increasingly erratic decisions driven by paranoia and wounded pride. He starts pulling out of legitimate business deals because he suspects everyone of being an informant, fires executives who ask too many questions about the Delaware companies, moves money between accounts in patterns that actually create more evidence for prosecutors while he thinks he's covering tracks. Subscribe if you want to see the psychology of powerful men when they start losing control, because what happens next is Graham making the kind of mistakes that accelerate his own downfall, the spiral where arrogance meets desperation and produces tactical errors that even good lawyers can't fix. He calls Vivian at 2 in the morning and says, "I want her arrested for extortion. I want her reputation destroyed so thoroughly that no jury would believe her even if she had video evidence. And I want it done before she has a chance to go public with whatever lies she's planning." Vivian tries to explain that aggressive moves at this point might backfire, might give prosecutors ammunition for obstruction charges, but Graham isn't interested in measured responses anymore. He wants total victory or total destruction, and he can't distinguish between the two. This is when the story accelerates into that final pre-climax phase, where all the threads we've been tracking start pulling toward each other like magnets approaching collision. And every choice anyone makes now echoes forward into consequences nobody can predict or control. Comment if you're ready for the climax because we're building toward it, but first you need to understand how completely the situation has deteriorated from that initial restaurant confrontation to this moment where Noelle is preparing to go public, Graham is unraveling, Torres is trying to maintain case integrity, Rhett is realizing his betrayal is going to cost him everything, and Vivian is planning an intervention that could turn violent. Meanwhile, the women from the legal aid clinic start receiving eviction notices as Graham's real estate trust begins the process of clearing the block, and they're calling Noelle's old number trying to reach her. leaving voicemails that say, "We need help. They're trying to force us out. We don't know what to do." And those messages sit in an inbox Noelle can't access because Torres won't let her use personal devices that could be traced. The media narrative continues to build against Noelle. Now there are think pieces about mentally ill women who target successful men. There are social media threads analyzing her body language and declaring her guilty of something even if the specifics are vague. There are legal commentators explaining why her testimony would be worthless in court because of her obvious instability and suspicious background. Drop a comment saying "fake news" if you've ever watched someone get railroaded by manufactured consensus, because this is how character assassination works in the digital age. You don't need to prove someone did something wrong, you just need to create enough smoke that people assume fire, and by the time the truth comes out, the damage is permanent and the target is already destroyed. Noelle reads these articles in the safe house, each one a knife in her resolve, and she starts to understand what Torres meant about the personal cost of exposure. She's going to tell her truth, and half the country is going to call her a liar anyway because Graham's money bought their assumptions before she ever got to speak. But here's what keeps her moving forward, what hardens her spine when doubt creeps in. She finds out through Torres that one of the women from the legal aid clinic, a young mother named Maria who filed a wage theft claim against one of Graham's partners, received a visit from someone matching Vivian's description, and that visit included threats specific enough to make Maria drop her case and move to a different state with her children in the middle of the night. That story breaks something in Noelle, or maybe it crystallizes something that was already there. The understanding that this isn't about one billionaire's bruised ego or one waitress's humiliation. This is about a system where the rich get to hurt people without consequences and the hurt people are expected to stay quiet and take it. And if she doesn't fight now with everything she has, then Maria's terror and those eviction notices and Graham's next victim are all on her conscience too. Subscribe right now if you believe one person can actually make a difference against systems designed to protect power, because what Noelle does next either proves that theory or destroys it, and there's no middle ground left. Torres sets up the infrastructure for Noelle's public exposure. They coordinate with journalists who have reputations for investigative integrity, they prepare evidence packets that can be verified independently, they establish secure communication channels, and they build a timeline for simultaneous release across multiple platforms so Graham can't suppress or control the narrative. But the night before they go public, the night before everything changes again, Noelle sits in that bland safe house apartment and writes letters she hopes she never has to send. One to her aunt in Arizona explaining why she made these choices, one to Eduardo thanking him for being the only person who stood up for her, and one to the women at the legal aid clinic apologizing for not being able to protect them the way she wanted to. Those letters sit in sealed envelopes on the kitchen counter. And if you've ever prepared for the possibility that you might not survive what comes next, you know the weight of that kind of goodbye. Ask yourself this question and let me see your answer in the comments, because it matters more than you think. When you're facing an enemy with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries, when the system is designed to protect them and punish you, when staying quiet means surviving but speaking up might mean dying, do you think one person's voice is enough to tip the balance? Or is that just a story we tell ourselves to feel better about living in a world where justice is for sale to the highest bidder? Before we dive into how Noelle Kincaid brings down a billionaire's empire, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because what you're about to witness is the kind of justice that doesn't happen often enough in real life. And if you've been following this story from the restaurant confrontation through the federal investigation and the media attacks, you deserve to see how it ends, so drop a like right now and let me ask you this. Do you think one woman with nothing but her voice and her truth can actually defeat a man with unlimited money and no conscience? Or is that just a fantasy we tell ourselves to sleep better at night? Because what happens in the next 72 hours will answer that question in ways that change Noelle's life, Graham's empire, and everyone caught between them. So let's jump into the morning when everything shifts from defense to all-out war, when the hunted becomes the hunter, and when silence finally breaks into something that can't be ignored or buried or bought. Noelle wakes up in that New Jersey safe house at 5 in the morning. Not because Agent Torres set an alarm, but because her body knows something big is coming. The way soldiers know before battle that today is different from yesterday. And she sits at the kitchen table with coffee that tastes like cardboard and a laptop that's been scrubbed clean of anything personal, staring at the draft of her public statement that will either vindicate her or mark her for destruction. The statement isn't just about Graham Sutter's fraud or Rhett Callahan's betrayal. It's about systems, about how wealth protects predators and punishes victims, about how silence is enforced through fear and violence and social pressure until speaking up feels impossible, and about how she's done being invisible just to survive because survival without dignity isn't really survival. It's just slow death with a paycheck. Comments speak up if you've ever wanted to tell your truth but stayed quiet because the cost felt too high. Because what Noelle does with this statement is she gives voice to everyone who's ever been crushed by power and told to take it quietly. And that's why her story matters beyond just one waitress versus one billionaire. Torres arrives at 6 with a team of 3 people Noelle hasn't met before. A media strategist named Marcus who used to work for nonprofit advocacy groups before going independent. A cybersecurity specialist named Yuki who monitors digital threats in real time, and a documentary filmmaker named James who's been recording witness testimonies from Graham's victims for the past year, waiting for the right moment to release his footage. These aren't federal agents. They're civilians who've been tracking Graham's network independently, building cases through journalism and activism in the spaces where law enforcement either can't reach or won't look, and their presence tells Noelle something crucial. This fight isn't just hers anymore. She's become the catalyst for something bigger that's been building in the shadows while Graham thought he was invincible. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of people organizing against corrupt systems, because what Marcus explains next is a masterclass in strategic exposure that uses every platform and every connection Noelle has built over years of quiet networking while pretending to be just a waitress. The plan Marcus lays out is multi-layered and coordinated across time zones, designed to hit Graham from so many directions simultaneously that his lawyers and fixers can't suppress or control the narrative before it reaches critical mass. First, Noelle contacts journalists in each investor's home country. The Spanish reporter in Miami who's been covering corporate fraud in Latin American markets. The French investigative team that specializes in international money laundering. The Qatari news network that has been tracking Western investment scams in the Gulf region, and the Silicon Valley tech blogger who's made a career exposing fake startup valuations. She doesn't just send them her statement. She provides translated evidence packets customized for each jurisdiction, showing how Graham's fraud specifically impacted their local investors, making the story personal and actionable for audiences who might otherwise ignore another American billionaire scandal. Subscribe right now if you want to see how one person's linguistic skills become a weapon against international corruption. Because what Noelle does next is she turns her years of translation work into a distribution network that bypasses Graham's media control entirely. Second, and this is where the legal aid connection becomes crucial, Noelle coordinates with the women she helped file claims over the past 3 years. Women who suffered wage theft, harassment, assault, and intimidation from Graham's business partners but were too scared to go public because of NDAs and threat of retaliation. Marcus has been in contact with these women through encrypted channels, building trust and documenting their stories, and now they're ready to speak collectively in a joint press conference that gives them safety in numbers and credibility through corroboration. Maria, the young mother who fled to another state after Vivian's threats, agrees to participate via video link, her face obscured but her voice steady when she describes how Graham's partner withheld her wages, threatened her immigration status, and made her work in conditions that violated every labor law while stealing money meant for her children's food and rent. Drop a comment saying "Believe women" if you think these testimonies matter as much as financial evidence, because what makes Noelle's approach powerful is that she's not just exposing numbers and shell companies, she's exposing human cost, making it impossible for people to dismiss this as a victimless white-collar crime. Third, and this is James the filmmaker's contribution, they release a documentary short, 28 minutes of interviews, documents, and timeline analysis that shows Graham's pattern of behavior spanning 15 years, from his first fraud conviction that got plea bargained down to a fine, through multiple harassment settlements, to the current international scheme that Noelle disrupted at the restaurant. The documentary includes footage from security cameras showing Graham's near-slap, interviews with former employees who describe his volatile behavior, and expert analysis from forensic accountants who explain in plain language how his shell companies work and why they're designed to defraud investors. This film gets uploaded to multiple platforms simultaneously with subtitles in 7 languages, making it accessible to global audiences and impossible to completely suppress even if Graham's lawyers try to issue takedowns. Hit subscribe if you're not locked in yet, because what happens when this documentary goes live is a cascade effect that nobody predicted, not even Marcus with all his strategic planning. But before any of this goes public, before Noelle pushes send on the emails, and before James uploads the documentary, there's one more piece that needs to be positioned, and it's the piece that makes everything else possible. Rhett Callahan's restaurant. Torres has been quietly gathering evidence about Rhett's complicity. The security footage he provided to Graham, the false harassment charges he filed, the employee records he shared without consent, and that evidence creates leverage that Marcus uses brilliantly. They offer Rhett a choice through his lawyer: cooperate fully with the investigation and federal prosecutors, provide sworn testimony about Graham's behavior and threats, hand over all security footage and business records showing Graham's use of the restaurant for illegal meetings, or face charges for witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Rhett tries to negotiate, tries to minimize his involvement, tries to claim he was just protecting his business, but Marcus doesn't negotiate. He just sends Rhett links to the documentary footage showing Rhett grabbing Noelle's wrist and dragging her out while Graham laughs, and asks if Rhett wants that to be his permanent image when this goes viral. Ask yourself this question and put your answer in the comments. If you were Rhett, facing the choice between taking responsibility for your betrayal or doubling down and hoping Graham's money protects you, which would you choose? Because what Rhett does in this moment defines not just his legal fate but his moral character. And watching someone face real consequences after choosing money over integrity is part of why this story resonates. Rhett breaks completely, calls his lawyer back within an hour, and agrees to everything. Full cooperation, sworn deposition, providing evidence, even agreeing to shut down his restaurant voluntarily pending investigation so that federal agents can sweep it for additional evidence without legal complications. He doesn't do this because he grew a conscience. He does it because he's terrified and realizes Graham can't protect him anymore, and maybe that's not noble redemption but it's functional justice, and sometimes that's enough. Now we're 12 hours before the coordinated release, and this is when the pressure builds in ways that make Noelle question everything one last time. Make her hands shake and her throat tighten and her brain scream that maybe safety is better than justice. Maybe disappearing is smarter than fighting, because what she's about to do can't be undone and the consequences will follow her for life. Torres sits with her in the safe house while Marcus makes final coordination calls in the other room, and the agent does something unexpected. She shows Noelle the file on Vivian March, Graham's fixer, and it's worse than anything Noelle imagined. Vivian has been connected to 3 disappearances, 5 hospitalizations, dozens of intimidation campaigns, and she operates with complete impunity because Graham's lawyers make problems go away and victims either take settlements or vanish, and Torres says quietly, "If you go forward, she will come for you, and we can offer protection but not prevention, which means you're accepting risk that could end with you in a hospital or worse. And I need you to understand that before you commit." Drop a like if this level of honesty from a federal agent surprises you, because Torres isn't trying to manipulate Noelle. She's giving her the full picture, because she respects her enough to let her make an informed choice. Noelle looks at those files, at photos of women who challenged Graham and ended up broken in various ways, and she thinks about that trailer park in Arizona where she grew up, about her mother dying because they couldn't afford treatment, about every job where she had to smile while men like Graham treated her like furniture, about Maria fleeing in the night with her children, about the legal aid clinic facing eviction, about every time silence felt like survival but really it was just practicing for your own funeral. She looks at Torres and says something that the agent later tells other investigators was the bravest thing she's ever heard from a civilian. "I've been afraid my whole life and it never kept me safe, it just kept me small. So if Vivian comes for me, at least she'll be coming for someone who fought back instead of someone who disappeared quietly. And maybe that's the difference between dying and being killed. One is passive and one is defiant. And I choose defiant." Subscribe and turn on notifications right now because what happens in the next 16 hours is a masterclass in how justice actually works when institutions fail and individuals refuse to stay silent. The press conference is scheduled for 10 in the morning at a community center in Queens, chosen specifically because it's on neutral ground with good security and multiple exits, and because the local community has been organizing against the real estate displacement Graham's trust is planning. So the audience includes activists and organizers who already understand the stakes. Noelle arrives with Torres and Marcus, moving through a back entrance while Yuki monitors social media for any sign that Graham's team knows what's coming, and what they find makes everyone's blood pressure spike. Vivian has been tracking their digital patterns and has identified the community center as a probable location, which means she knows something is happening today even if she doesn't know specifics. Torres makes a call and suddenly there are plainclothes NYPD officers positioned around the building, federal marshals in unmarked cars, and enough law enforcement presence that any attempt at physical intimidation would be suicidal, which is exactly the point. Noelle is giving her testimony in the open, on camera, protected by systems that are supposed to work but only do when someone forces them to pay attention. Comment protection if you think law enforcement should have been protecting Noelle all along instead of waiting until she created a media spectacle, because that's part of the critique embedded in this story. Justice shouldn't require heroics, it should be automatic and accessible, but in reality it's often neither, and people like Noelle have to risk everything just to get the system to do its basic job. The press conference room fills with journalists from a dozen outlets, cameras from major networks and independent media, representatives from investor groups in 3 countries, lawyers from the legal aid network, and most importantly, the women whose testimonies will corroborate Noelle's evidence. Maria appears on a large screen via secure video link, her face partially obscured but her voice clear, and when she describes what Graham's partner did to her. Stealing wages, threatening deportation, creating conditions so desperate she considered dangerous options just to feed her children. You can hear people in the room drawing sharp breaths, feel the mood shift from curiosity to rage. Noelle steps to the microphone at exactly 10 a.m., and if you could see her face in that moment, you'd understand what courage actually looks like. It's not fearlessness, it's fear mixed with resolve. It's shaking hands that hold the microphone steady anyway. It's a voice that cracks on the first word but strengthens with each sentence. She tells the story from the beginning, from growing up poor and stacking credentials, from translation work that exposed her to Graham's network, from threats that drove her underground, from the steakhouse job that was supposed to be invisibility but became a sting operation, from Graham's humiliation and near violence, from Rhett's betrayal and the media attacks, from the choice she faced between safety and truth. She speaks for 17 minutes without stopping, and then she does something that changes everything. She switches between languages, repeating key points in Spanish, French, Arabic, German, making sure investors watching in different countries hear directly from her in their native tongues, eliminating any translation filter that might soften or distort her accusations. Hit that subscribe button if you're not already locked in, because while Noelle is speaking at that community center, federal agents are executing coordinated raids on Graham's offices in Manhattan, Delaware, and the Cayman Islands, serving warrants for documents related to the shell companies and interviewing employees who've been waiting for immunity deals before they'd cooperate. This timing isn't coincidental. Torres coordinated with prosecutors so that the press conference would provide cover for the raids, making it harder for Graham to claim persecution or political motivation when there's a public victim telling her story simultaneously. Graham himself is in his penthouse when agents arrive with warrants, and witnesses later describe him as shocked, genuinely unable to process that the machinery of law enforcement is actually moving against him, despite his lawyer's assurances that everything was under control. He calls Vivian immediately, voice tight with panic, and says, "Fix this now, I don't care how, just make it stop," which is exactly the kind of recorded conversation that prosecutors love, because it shows consciousness of guilt and obstruction intent. Vivian is already moving toward the community center in Queens when she gets Graham's call, already planning an intervention that might involve fire alarms or bomb threats or any of the tactics she's used before to disrupt proceedings. But what she doesn't know is that Yuki has been monitoring her digital footprint and has alerted law enforcement to her approach. When Vivian's car pulls up to the community center, she finds her path blocked by plainclothes officers who randomly decide to check permits for a construction project on the same block, creating enough delay that by the time she gets inside the building, Noelle has already finished her statement and the Q&A with journalists has begun. Comment too late if you love watching a fixer realize she can't fix this, because Vivian stands in the back of that press conference room, calculating angles, and for the first time in her professional career, she can't find a play that works. There are too many cameras, too many witnesses, too much law enforcement presence, and any move she makes will be captured on 24 phones and broadcast instantly. But Vivian didn't become Graham's fixer by giving up easily, and what she does next is desperate and brilliant and ultimately self-destructive. She walks to the front of the room, interrupts a journalist's question, and speaks directly to Noelle on camera, saying, "You're lying about Mr. Sutter for attention and money, and we have proof you extorted him for payment to keep quiet about fabricated accusations, which makes you a criminal, and I'm here to tell you that if you don't recant immediately, we'll pursue charges that will put you in prison." It's a bluff, a last-ditch attempt to intimidate Noelle into backing down, but Vivian makes a fatal miscalculation. She does this on live camera with multiple legal experts in the room, and what she just said constitutes witness intimidation in real time, captured on video from a dozen angles, impossible to deny or contextualize away. Marcus, who's been standing near the cameras, responds immediately, "For the record, can you state your name and your relationship to Graham Sutter?" Vivian realizes her mistake too late, tries to backtrack, but the room has already erupted with journalists shouting questions. Are you threatening a witness? Who do you work for? Is Mr. Sutter paying you to be here? Torres steps forward with federal credentials and says calmly, "Ma'am, I need you to step outside with me for questioning regarding witness tampering." And suddenly Vivian is being escorted out of the room by federal agents while cameras capture every second, and the narrative Graham spent weeks building. That Noelle is the problem, the liar, the criminal, collapses in the time it takes for one arrogant operative to overplay her hand. Hit that like if you believe in karma catching up with people who've spent years escaping consequences, because watching Vivian get detained for the same intimidation tactics she's used against dozens of victims is justice in its purest form. Back at Graham's offices, federal agents find exactly what prosecutors hoped for and more. Documents showing the Delaware shell companies were designed specifically to hide assets from investors and regulatory oversight, emails between Graham and his accountant detailing how to manipulate quarterly reports to show profit while actually operating at massive losses, correspondence with business partners discussing how to handle the Maria problem, and other women who filed claims, and perhaps most damning, a spreadsheet tracking payouts to media outlets and social media amplification services for the campaign against Noelle. This last piece of evidence is what transforms the case from financial fraud into racketeering territory, because it shows Graham wasn't just stealing money, he was operating a criminal enterprise that used intimidation, defamation, and witness tampering as standard business practices, and the legal implications are exponentially worse than simple securities fraud. Subscribe right now if you want to understand how billionaires actually fall, because it's never just one thing. It's an accumulation of evidence that individually might be explainable but collectively paints a picture so damning that even expensive lawyers can't make juries ignore it. The investors who were at that restaurant start filing complaints in their home jurisdictions within hours of Noelle's press conference. The Miami investor contacts the SEC and Florida state regulators. The French investor reaches out to the Autorite de Marches financiers in Paris. The Houston investor files with Texas securities authorities, and suddenly Graham is facing legal action in multiple countries with multiple regulatory bodies, each one operating on different timelines and different legal standards, creating a web of liability that his lawyers can't coordinate effectively. One jurisdiction might be willing to settle, but all of them simultaneously means someone will push for prosecution. And that's the crack that breaks the dam. Rhett Callahan tries to flee that same afternoon, packing a bag in his apartment and booking a flight to Toronto under a fake name. But he gets detained at LaGuardia Airport because Torres flagged him as a material witness, and when agents search his luggage, they find documents he was planning to destroy. Backup copies of security footage, financial records showing Graham paid him $50,000 after Noelle's firing, and emails discussing how to coordinate their stories about what happened at the restaurant. Drop a comment saying "busted" if you think running away proves guilt more than anything else could. Because Rhett's attempted flight destroys any remaining credibility he had and turns him from a cooperating witness into a co-conspirator, which means his testimony becomes less valuable while his legal jeopardy increases dramatically. His lawyer negotiates surrender terms, and within 24 hours of Noelle's press conference, Rhett is sitting in an interrogation room telling prosecutors everything he knows about Graham's use of the restaurant for private meetings where illegal deals were structured and finalized. The two women who flanked Graham at that dinner, the ones touching his shoulder like investments, make their own calculations within 48 hours of the raids, and both arrive at the same conclusion independently. Graham is going down, and they need to save themselves before they're dragged down with him. The accountant, whose name is Patricia, contacts prosecutors through her lawyer and offers to turn state's evidence in exchange for immunity. And what she brings to the table is years of financial records showing exactly how Graham structured frauds, who knew what and when, which investors were intentionally deceived versus which were willfully ignorant, and how the network of business partners operated like an organized crime family with Graham as the Don. The other woman, whose name is Simone and who actually is Graham's girlfriend of 3 years, provides something equally valuable. Recordings, dozens of them, made secretly on her phone during dinners and meetings where Graham bragged about his schemes, laughed about manipulating investors, and discussed strategies for silencing victims like they were discussing weather patterns. Hit that like button if you're not surprised that even people close to Graham were documenting evidence in case they needed leverage someday, because that's what happens in criminal enterprises. Nobody trusts anyone, everyone is preparing for betrayal, and loyalty only extends as far as mutual benefit. Simone's recordings are particularly devastating because they capture Graham's voice, his words, his intent, in ways that make defenses like misunderstanding or taken out of context impossible to maintain. In one recording from 6 months earlier, Graham literally says, "The trick is making them think they're partners when really they're marks, and by the time they realize they've been played, their money is already moved and their legal options are buried under NDAs and arbitration clauses," which is essentially a confession to conspiracy to commit fraud delivered with the casual confidence of someone who thinks he's untouchable. Subscribe and turn on those notifications because what happens over the next 2 weeks is the kind of collapse that makes for business school case studies. Graham's board of directors votes to remove him as CEO amid concerns about his judgment and legal exposure, which is corporate speak for "we're throwing him overboard to save ourselves." His major investors pull out of projects and demand audits. His bank accounts get frozen pending investigation of potential asset hiding, and his social media presence gets decimated by videos from the press conference going viral with commentary from legal experts explaining exactly how his schemes worked. The documentary James released hits 2 million views in the first 72 hours, gets picked up by major streaming platforms, and spawns follow-up investigations by news outlets in 6 countries, each one uncovering additional victims and additional schemes that Graham thought he'd buried years ago. But the moment that really ends Graham Sutter, the one that makes it impossible for him to rehabilitate his image or negotiate his way out, happens 3 weeks after Noelle's press conference when he agrees to do a television interview thinking he can charm his way back to public sympathy, and instead he walks into a trap that exposes everything remaining of his character. The interviewer asks about the women who testified at the press conference, and Graham calls them liars seeking attention and money, says they're coordinating a shakedown that's essentially organized crime, and when the interviewer shows him documents proving his companies did withhold wages and violate labor laws, Graham smirks and says, "Sometimes you have to break a few eggs to build an empire, and if some people got their feelings hurt along the way, that's unfortunate, but that's capitalism. And I don't apologize for winning." Comment sociopath if those words make your stomach turn, because what Graham just did on national television is confirm everything Noelle and the other women said about him. He doesn't see them as people, he sees them as obstacles or resources, and he genuinely believes his success justifies any harm he caused along the way. That interview becomes Exhibit A in multiple cases, gets shown to juries as proof of his mindset and his lack of remorse, and legal experts later say it was the single most damaging piece of evidence in the prosecution's arsenal because it showed jurors exactly who Graham Sutter was beneath the expensive suits and charitable foundation branding. Within 6 months of Noelle's press conference, Graham is arrested on multiple counts spanning 3 countries: securities fraud in the United States, wire fraud, witness tampering, racketeering, money laundering in the Cayman Islands, and fraud charges in France related to the investors he deceived. The investors themselves face civil penalties but avoid criminal charges by cooperating with investigations and demonstrating they were deceived rather than complicit, though several lose substantial amounts of money and their reputations take hits in their respective business communities. Rhett loses his restaurant through a combination of legal fees, loss of business after his role becomes public, and federal seizure related to his cooperation agreement, and he ends up working as a consultant for a food service company in New Jersey under a different name because his reputation in Manhattan is permanently destroyed. Hit subscribe if you're still with me because we're approaching the part where Noelle's life transforms from victim to something else entirely, where she stops being defined by what was done to her and starts being defined by what she did about it. The Legal Aid Network receives vindication when courts reopen cases that were previously dismissed or settled under suspicious circumstances, and several women who took payouts years ago get to file new claims with the benefit of Graham's criminal conviction supporting their credibility. The community center where Noelle held her press conference becomes a hub for organizing against predatory real estate practices, and Graham's plan to buy and demolish that city block dies when his assets get frozen and his real estate trust collapses under investigation. Maria, the young mother who fled after Vivian's threats, returns to New York with pro bono legal support and successfully files for full back wages plus damages. And she uses that money to start a small business helping other immigrant women navigate labor law and protect themselves from exploitation. Vivian March, the fixer who thought she was untouchable because Graham's money made problems disappear, faces her own reckoning when prosecutors build a case showing she participated in witness intimidation, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and potentially assault charges related to some of those hospitalizations connected to her past work. She tries to flip on Graham, offering testimony in exchange for reduced charges, but prosecutors already have Patricia the accountant and Simone the girlfriend. So Vivian's information is redundant, and her credibility is shot by her recorded threat at the press conference. She ends up taking a plea deal that includes prison time and permanent disbarment from any security or investigative work, and the last public sighting of her is entering a federal facility in handcuffs, the woman who made careers out of intimidating others finally experiencing consequences for her actions. Drop a like if watching corrupt systems actually face accountability feels almost surreal because it happens so rarely, and ask yourself why stories like this are important even when they're fictional. Because they show us what's possible when individuals refuse to stay silent, when communities organize around shared interests, when journalists do their jobs instead of just repeating press releases, and when law enforcement actually follows evidence instead of protecting powerful people. Noelle's transformation into a public figure isn't easy or clean. She deals with PTSD from the threats and the stress. She has nightmares about Graham's near slap and Vivian's cold calculations. She struggles with trust issues because she learned that even federal agents were using her without full disclosure. But she also discovers something powerful. Visibility is its own form of protection because it's harder to silence someone the public is watching. And her voice carries weight now not because she's famous, but because she proved herself credible under pressure that would have broken most people. 6 months after Graham's arrest, Noelle gets offered a position at an international consulting firm that specializes in corporate fraud investigation and prevention, and they want her specifically for her linguistic skills and her lived experience understanding how fraud impacts vulnerable populations. The salary is 3 times what she made at the steakhouse, the work is meaningful rather than performative, and most importantly, she gets to use her full self. The educated, multilingual, strategically brilliant person she always was but had to hide because visibility meant danger. Subscribe right now if you believe people deserve second chances and new beginnings, because what Noelle does with this opportunity shows you don't have to be perfect to be heroic. You just have to refuse to give up even when giving up looks like the smartest survival strategy. But the moment that completes Noelle's arc, the scene that mirrors the opening and shows how completely her world has transformed, happens 8 months after the press conference when she walks into a different high-end Manhattan restaurant. Not as a server, but as a consultant hired by the ownership group to review their labor practices and ensure they're complying with wage laws and worker protection regulations. She's wearing a professional suit instead of an apron, carrying a briefcase instead of a water pitcher. And when she enters the dining room, servers recognize her from news coverage and social media, and their eyes widen with something between respect and hope because she represents proof that the industry can be challenged, that abuse doesn't have to be tolerated, that workers have power if they're willing to use it collectively. During her inspection, Noelle observes a wealthy businessman at a corner table snap his fingers at a young waitress, bark an order without making eye contact, then complain about imaginary problems with his food in that particular tone that's designed to humiliate rather than communicate. The waitress, who looks maybe 22 and has that exhausted determination Noelle remembers from her own service years, handles it professionally, but you can see her shoulders tense, see her jaw tighten, see that moment where she's swallowing rage just to keep her job. Comment, intervene, if you want to see what happens when someone with authority refuses to let that behavior slide. Because Noelle walks directly to that table, introduces herself as a labor consultant working with management, and says to the businessman in a voice that carries across the dining room, "I noticed you're having difficulty communicating with your server in a respectful manner, and I want you to know that this establishment has zero tolerance for customer behavior that creates hostile working conditions for staff, so I'm going to need you to treat her with basic human decency, or we'll need you to leave and find a restaurant where workers are treated as disposable, because that's not the culture here." The businessman sputters, tries to pull rank, says something about knowing the owners, but Noelle doesn't flinch. She's been through worse than his empty threats, faced down billionaires and fixers in federal investigations, and his posturing looks small and sad compared to what she's already survived. The waitress watches this intervention with something like disbelief, and when the businessman storms out rather than apologize, she turns to Noelle with tears in her eyes and says in Spanish, "Thank you. Nobody has ever stood up for me like that before." And Noelle responds in the same language, "You deserve respect, and don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise, and here's my card. If you need help or if anyone here retaliates against you for this, call me immediately." That exchange, that moment of solidarity between women separated by circumstance but united by shared experience in service industry trenches, is what justice looks like when it works. Not just punishing bad actors but protecting vulnerable people and changing cultures so abuse becomes unacceptable instead of normalized. Hit that subscribe button one more time and turn on notifications because stories like Noelle's matter. Stories about people who refuse to stay small even when staying small looks like safety. Stories about systems that can be challenged even when they look invincible. Stories about voices that carry power when enough people choose to listen rather than dismiss. Graham Sutter served 7 years in federal prison before being released on parole with conditions that include financial transparency requirements and prohibitions on holding corporate officer positions, which effectively ends his business career but doesn't undo the harm he caused to hundreds of people over decades of operation. Some of his victims receive restitution from asset seizures, others get nothing because the money was already hidden or spent, and that's the messy reality of justice. It's better than nothing, but it's never perfect, never fully restorative, never enough to truly balance the scales. But what does change, what matters beyond individual cases and individual convictions, is the cultural impact of stories like Noelle's being told publicly and amplified through media and social networks until they become part of collective consciousness. The documentary about Graham's network becomes required viewing in some business ethics courses. Noelle gets invited to speak at universities about whistleblowing and worker protection. The legal aid clinic she worked with receives massive increases in funding and support, and most importantly, other people in similar situations see her example and make different choices, find courage in her courage, refuse to stay silent because she proved that speaking up is possible even when it's terrifying. Drop a final comment telling me what you learned from Noelle's story, what you'd do differently if you faced similar circumstances, whether you think one person really can change systems or if that's just comforting mythology we tell ourselves to feel less powerless. Because here's my final question for you, the one that determines whether this story matters beyond entertainment. When you face your own moment of choice, your own Graham Sutter at your own table 12, your own decision between safety through silence or risk through truth, will you remember Noelle Kincaid and choose differently than you might have before hearing her story? Or will fear win like it usually does? And if fear does win, is that failure or just survival? And how do we distinguish between the two when we're the ones making the choice in real time with incomplete information and very real consequences? Answer that question in the comments, share the story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel because we tell stories about power, justice, and people who refuse to accept that the world has to stay broken just because it's always been broken. And maybe if enough of us believe that change is possible and act like it's possible, eventually the world starts reflecting that belief back to us in ways that look like progress. And isn't that worth fighting for even when the fight looks impossible?